What's going on, everyone? Welcome into the Inside Bassmaster Podcast, episode 83. I'm your host, Ronnie Moore. My co-host, as always, Kyle Jessie, the digital content editor of Bassmaster.com. And we're doing our segment that we do once per month, and it's called the Pattern of the Month segment. In May, we had Jason Christie coming off a victory at Lake Chickamauga, has so many great successes in the month of May. Then we did June with Matt Airy. He didn't even know he had so much success in June, but every single year on the Elite Series, he's made a top 10 in the month of June and just barely missed one at Pickwick last month. So why not do the month of July, kind of that segment, Kyle, from when we go down south and we transition up north, a guy who's always in the AOY race, it seems, and when we head to smallmouth country, someone to watch in the month of July, and that is Mr. Brandon Palaniuk.
Absolutely. We're excited to talk to Brandon today. Obviously, July is such a tricky time for bass fishing in general because a lot of people in the South just about done bass fishing in the South because it gets too hot. So you see all the tournaments go north for good reason. That's when the fishing gets good. And this is definitely when Brandon gets really good. Granted, Brandon's pretty good all the time at this point, but he gets really hot when we go north and pretty much turns it on when we go up there.
100%. Brandon, my first question about the month of July is, what do you think about there's obviously two different trains of thought, maybe three or four when it comes to southern bodies of water, northern bodies of water, largemouth versus smallmouth. What does the month of July say to you if there are various answers?
It says cool mornings with sweatshirts and a pair of pants and a nice cool breeze coming off of Lake Ontario. That is what I'd love in July. Down south, things are getting hot. And the thing that you have to keep in mind is that even though a bass is a warm water species, the largest bass in that body of water are still going to prefer cooler water temps. That's why as the summer starts to progress, it gets hot. What do? We suck into the air conditioner, right? Well, the bass, they don't have an AC, so they have to go find ways that they can get that cooler water. And then we also know that that cooler water has a higher oxygen content. And so this doesn't mean that all the bass are going to go one direction, right? I mean, there will be bass that will stay shallow, but a lot of these bass, and when I say they want cooler water temperatures, that's going to come in one of three ways. That's either going to come from depth, right, which we see a lot during the summer, heavy cover, so matted vegetation, some type of shade that can create cover. It could be docks or something that's going to create that shade to cool that water. And then also current. Current is going to usually have a higher oxygen content. It's going to be a little bit cooler. And so that can be up rivers or the bases of dams and things like that. But you have to find one of those things or a combination of those things, and that's generally where those fish are going to be. There's not just a black and white answer to say this is where the fish are going, but one thing is guaranteed: they're going to be looking for those cooler water temperatures or those higher oxygen contents.
You make a good point there, because it seems like typically when you talk about May, June, that's when you find your fish schooled up, ganged up out deep. But you see the shift in July, August, when it gets really, really hot. A lot of guys, will stay deep, but you see a lot more guys go shallow just for the sake of, if it's going to be tough to get bites one way or another, shallow a lot of times is just the way to go. Talk about some of those areas that if you decide to go shallow that you're going to look at first. Obviously you mentioned a few of them there, but kind of your favorite places to fish in the fish shallow in the heat of the summer.
Generally, the first thing I'm going to look for is like any major creeks that have flowing water in the backs of them. That's important. It can be a big, giant, long running creek, but if there's not a good flow of water source in the back of that, the bait's not going to be there. The fish aren't going to be there nearly as much. And the crazy thing that I've seen is you can have warm water in the main basin of those, shallow pockets and things. But if it has, a little bit cooler or flowing water coming in through the back, that will create enough oxygen and disturbance where that bait will stay in there. And then you've also got, a lot of the bluegill that'll suck up in there and stay around in those places. And so generally I want those, I want some flowing water if I'm going to fish shallow or some type of water movement. And that comes in various forms. And then I also want a good amount of that shallow cover that has access to deep water. Generally not just a big flat, or if it's on a big flat, it has a good, winding creek channel through that those fish can migrate on, because at some point they may need to bail on that, right? It may get too hot or something, or, storms come in and they want to be able to transition back and forth. And so they need to have close access to deep water, even though they may not be in that deep water.
Yeah, and one thing that I always think about in July, as I am one of the guys who targets the 7 bass that are still shallow in that month, in the state of Arkansas, obviously I get a little bit better at fishing shallow than offshore, but it's the influx or the effect of other forage. The bluegill spawn probably finished up just a few weeks prior to that, depending on where you are. Maybe it just finished up more recently. The first week of July, it might have been just happening. And then obviously shad spawn's not too far away from that. Those fish that are post spawn can hang around and guard fry. All those kinds of things factor in. But when it comes to those offshore bait fish that will not only the water temperature draws those fish offshore down south, but also the forage has got to be there. They're going to be near their food source. They're not going to run too far away from the buffet. And so for those gizzard shad that we see cruising the bank earlier in the spring, how do they react out deeper? Because we see guys throwing white bass imitating crankbaits, or we throw gizzard shad imitating baits. Are they grouped up like balls of threadfin shad? Because they're so much bigger. So how do they react, and how do the bass position themselves around those in the summertime out deeper?
One thing that I've really learned with my electronics, especially with Mega Live in the last couple years, is that I've really been able to pay attention on how those schools of bait move and how the bass react to them. And one of the biggest things I've learned is that those bait fish, they will group up based on whatever type of bait it is, and they'll stay tight together, right? Whether it's threadfin or it's gizzard, and they swim differently, they react differently, they move differently based on what type of bait fish it is, and then that's going to change how those bass react to them. And so that really depends on your lake, right? Like, what is the main forage? And we know that bass are generally the bigger bass are going to chase those bigger gizzard shad if they're available. They're not everywhere, but if there's a good gizzard shad population, places like Lake Fork, those bigger bass are going to chase those gizzards a lot of times, right? Because bass, they're opportunistic feeders. People hear me say that a lot. They want the most bang for their buck. And, they, especially a largemouth, when we're talking about a largemouth, they're more of like an ambush feeder where they want to hang out, sit around a piece of cover, and then when the shad come by, they want to jump out, grab them, and then go back. Like, that's how they get fat. That's how they, their metabolism is going so fast as it starts to heat up. So the least amount of energy they can expend and still get a big meal, the better. That's why you see places that have a bunch of blueback herring and stuff. You catch those fish in July, they may be this long, but they're that big, right? They're little cigars. And that's just because they're burning more calories than what they can take in based on their food source.
Is that, before you say jump in, Kyle, is that the same principle, Brandon, for when we talk about big glide baits or big swim baits? When you talk about like a big object, you see the biggest dock or a barge tie up, and you throw that big swim bait out there because they're opportunistic. They want to ambush something, and you can get away with throwing a bigger bait on a piece of cover because if they're there, you can fool them that way. I know that's an all season type of technique, but that kind of made sense with what you were talking about of in the summertime, they're just going to hang out and kind of sell out for a big meal.
Yeah, 100%. And what we see happen a lot of times as we transition into July is that if you are moving kind of towards where there's more schools of fish, right? If you're fishing up shallow, a lot of times you're fishing for more individual fish. But right, as you get closer toward that deep water and around a lot of that bait, you'll see that a lot of those fish get grouped up. Well, how many times have you thrown a wacky rig or something in there? You set the hook on a 3-pounder and the 6-pounder comes following your bait out. I've always been under the theory that like I want to catch that 6-pounder and have the 3-pounder follow out. So I'm going to throw the biggest bait I got first and try to trick that 6-pounder. And I'm under the belief that a lot of times that bigger fish will just let the smaller baits go because he doesn't want to exert that energy to go get that bait that's not going to, he's like, nah, it's like a balancing act for him. He's like, that's going to be too much energy for what I'm going to get out of it.
Yet he's still curious, so he's going to just check out what happened. But yeah,
and he's like, oh yeah, he's like, well, what do you got? Maybe I'll just eat you since you're acting all funky. And, but you throw a big swim bait in there, he's like, oh, that's really easy to eat. It's moving super slow, and I can just slide on over there and open my mouth, go back to my little dock.
So, Brandon, this is something I've noticed here in the last 2 events of the Elite Series season. I've kind of been wanting to ask really anybody, but I think you'd be able to answer it as good as anybody. So, with the introduction of forward-facing sonar, and we'll talk about fishing deep here. Obviously, the last 2 events, a lot of offshore fishing, deep, Fork, Pickwick. In the pre-spawn periods of the year, a lot of times you don't see guys sit at the console and graph over areas before they fish them. They'll pull up with a forward-facing sonar, look at what they're, trying to look for, and just bounce. The last 2 tournaments, and I suspect we'll see, more of it moving forward in these summertime tournaments, hot, middle of the year time of, middle of the year. What is the purpose of trying to graph over those fish first, and then even when you're leaving, graphing over them with your console? Because it seems like, outside of practice, that has become something that a lot of guys don't do, especially not the tournament.
The biggest thing is just efficiency, because we're all given the same 8 hours in a day to compete with. And when you locate these places where these fish will school up, we'll just use Pickwick for an example, because that was one of our last ones. I know it was toward the end of June, but or I guess it was actually toward the end of May. But
is that first week of June? But they were doing what they're going to be doing in July. They're just
doing the same thing in
different.
Summertime things. Yeah,
they're gonna do the same thing in July. It's actually gonna just progressively get better in July. But the big thing there is that they're current oriented, right, on their feed windows. And so in the summer, those feed windows, right, they may not feed all day long. And so they're triggered by certain things like current, or it could be the lack of sunlight based on cloud cover, or early mornings, late evenings. And so when guys are idling like that, they're trying to identify whether or not those fish are set up correctly, because you can pull up on a place, the fish aren't set up right, and you just don't get a bite, right? You may idle over, they're suspended real high, they're spread out, kind of one here, one there, maybe 2 here. A lot of times you're just wasting your time. You may get one of those fish to bite, but what you're doing is you're actively moving, looking for one of those active schools, so that when you do idle over it and you're looking around like, okay, staring at my Solix unit, and all of a sudden you start coming right by your waypoint and you look down at your Mega DI and it's like, and they're just stacked up real close to the bottom, and you can tell that those fish are set up to feed, and then you spin around and you start catching them. And so it's really just about being efficient. Our electronics have gotten so good that when you spend time with them, you understand like what looks right and what doesn't look right. Now, that just because our electronics are so good does not mean that anybody that buys them is just going to go out there and find fish with them. You still have to have the fundamentals to know where to even go look for in the first place.
We don't want to hear that, Brandon. Every fan is, you lost your ability to catch fish 3 years ago when you put graphs on your boat, but before that you didn't know how to catch them. That's what all these guys
I call them, they're fun amplifiers. Okay, that's what I call them. Electronics are fun amplifiers. If you don't know how to go catch a bass without them, you're not going to catch a bass with them. But if you do know how to catch a bass without them, and then you put electronics on your boat, right, Mega 360, whatever, all it does is it just amplifies the fun, because you're just going to catch more fish
in less time. You're going to save a lot more time.
In less time. And I know plenty of guys that didn't catch fish before electronics, and they put a bunch of money into it. They put electronics on their boat, and they still catch the same amount of fish. they still weigh the same amount.
This is a friendly
So this is-
podcast. You can totally tell us who you're talking about because
So
I'm just kidding.
I was
I'm not
actually
talking
gonna
about either one of you, but you guys both just assumed that I was.
No, I was wanting to know some elite names or just throw some guys out there that are like, man, that guy's got 19
No, I just
grabs.
I see it at all levels.
Yes. No, 100%.
Levels.
So, okay, I was going to actually ask you about this, but this is a perfect transition to ask you. So, Craig Lamb actually told me a story yesterday about last year, I want to say at St. Lawrence, you were staying down near Cape Vincent during practice just to not have to drive back and forth. Basically, I assume just for time's sake. And I thought that was crazy, but it kind of brings me to the point. I think that most people assume that you just go out there and you idle over the first spot that looks good on your graph and you just find them and it happens. Talk about how much time you put in practice, because I think, like I said, that the average fan doesn't understand how many hours you sit behind your graph and try to find these places. Can you talk about that a little bit just to clear that up?
To try to find the two spots that actually worked for you at Lake Fork, the two spots to get second. Like,
I mean, it's not really as quick of a process as people may think.
No, and this time of year you have way more hours, right? I love fishing in the springtime because it gets dark at 4:30 and I'm forced to get off the water. I get like all kinds of sleep. Like, you eat dinner by 6:30, you're like, what am I gonna do? I'm gonna edit some videos. This time of year, we come up north, we've got more daylight hours. You can be on the water at 5 a.m. and you may be able to be on the water until 9:30 p.m.
You have 3 meals packed in your boat.
And I do. And that's what I do. And so, like what you brought up about Craig saying I was sleeping down toward the lake, that's true. Even though we have a camper and everything, when we launch out of Waddington, a lot of times I will just park it up there and Tiff will stay in the camper and I sleep in the back of my truck during practice down toward the lake, because for me, it's not worth giving up those hours of drive time, right? Like you spend an hour driving down there in the morning, an hour driving back in the afternoon, and it's not worth it, right? That's 2 more hours of sleep that I could have got, or 2 more hours I could have put on the lake. And in those 2 hours may be the time that I find where those fish are at, right? They may be when I find that winning area. And I mean, there's so many events that I've done well in that I got that clue in just the last little bit of the last day of practice, and that I can't tell you how many times like that has worked out in my favor, right? Even if you don't get it dialed in, you just get the clues that then allow you to build on it during the tournament. And that's when you're really dangerous.
Well, Brandon, I wanted to segue halfway of this show. I know that the guys who are up north are like, I don't care about southern largemouth because our fish are biting up north. And so why not make a segue to the angler of the year? I'm not going to say if it's 1 point or 350 points. I talked to Kyle about that. I said, make sure we don't do it. I will tell a quick story about, I text out the top 3 angler of the year and rookie of the year standings, like a little graphic I make. I send it to the guys after each event, and I sent it to Brandon, and he just saw the text that I wrote and it said like angler of the year update. And I didn't even think about it. So I sent it to him and he deleted my text and messaged me on Instagram and said, hey, I'm not looking at your text, so just know I'm not ignoring you. And so the next graphic I sent him, it just had his name and everything else was blurred out for the next one. So we're not going to reveal anything, but as we do make our turn up north with 3 events left, 2/3 of the season's in the books, and we're going to the place that you said, I said, what do you think about in July? And you said, sweatshirts, cool mornings, and Lake Ontario. And that is exactly where we're going. And Kyle, whether we've been there in June, July, August, or September, Brandon Palaniuk on the St. Lawrence River in Ontario has a 6th, a 10th, a 7th, a 3rd, a 1st, and he sucked one year real bad and got 19th. So it's obviously a place that it's not a money in the bank, but for fantasy fishing, I mean, you might as well cash that check.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to think that anything is guaranteed, but it's a place that I love it so much up here. I'm sitting here right now. We're set up at our campground. Got here a couple days early, and I just love this part of the country. Ever since we first came up here, or I first came here in 2013, I just fell in love with it. I love big smallmouth. I love clear water. I love massive bodies of water where you can spread out and do different things and get away from guys. And it gives you the opportunity to really find something unique and special. And you know, I'm excited. I'm looking forward to this event. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And you don't know what to expect when you come up here, because northern fisheries, more than anything, and got to make this point so that guys understand this, or I think a lot of guys don't think about this, or girls, guys or girls don't think about this. When you're looking at July in the summertime up north, and this applies to down south too, but not as much because the seasons aren't as extreme. But these bass live under the ice for 6 months out of the year. And so everything happens much faster. And I learned this from at home. Like, when these fish start to transition, it happens very fast because everything is condensed in a smaller window of time, right? They only have 6 months of open water versus 12 months of open water. So essentially your transitional periods are happening twice as fast. And I've watched these smallmouth go all the way back to 2012. This is one of my favorite examples because it was so obvious to me when we were at Green Bay. The first day, a lot of guys were catching them off of the beds, right? They were spawning day one. And by day two, you know, I kind of had like my own area that I was fishing there, but I would catch majority of my weight by noon, and then I would go look around. And what I realized is that these fish were spawning. By day two, they were on these shoals that were 10 to 13 foot. By day three, they were like 16 to 18. And by day four, those bass were out on shoals that they weren't around even remotely close in practice, like not a bass. And then literally felt like every bass in the lake was in 20 to 23 foot of water. And that's where I ended up catching them the last day. But it was because I knew that those fish were transitioning that fast. Literally every day they would move from zone to zone to zone. And when we come up here, that's something that you have to keep in mind, right? And that's like number one goal when I start practice up here, is figuring out what stage those fish are in, right? Like how close to the spawn are they? Was it a cold winter, a really cold winter, cold spring, and are these fish behind, or was it vice versa and these fish are way ahead of the schedule? And you have to pay attention to that when you come up north, because it will have a much bigger impact on where those fish are at, you know, based on their seasonal movements.
Now, Brandon, you kind of mentioned this lightly there to begin with, but one thing that really I always think about when you come to the St. Lawrence, and really you can tailor this to just smallmouth fishing in general, but 2020, when we took out of Clayton, everybody expected you on day one to be headed to the lake, but you stayed in the river. Obviously, I imagine for a lot of different reasons, but almost seemed like trying to stay away from people, like you mentioned, trying to find something to yourself. How important is that to you when smallmouth fishing versus, you know, largemouth fishing in the South?
You know, I mean, it really comes into play. When you look at the weights up north, generally they are so tight together, right? There may only be like 1.5 pounds that separates 10th from 50th. And so being able to find something to yourself where you can manage those fish, or you can pick off those couple extra 4.5 pounders, because the difference between like a 4.5 pounder and a 4.25 pounder may not seem like a lot, but when you come up north, it's almost like your 5 fish limit flip-flops from down south. So down there, a lot of times, you know, like Florida especially, your bag is really told, the story is told by the biggest fish in your bag. When you come up north, the story is told by the smallest one in your bag. Like, what is the smallest fish? Because if you have a 2 pounder and then you have all 4 pounders, you're going to be way, way down there. But if you replace that with another 4 pounder, you may jump 60 places. Mm-hmm. And so that that really changes. And when you're able to find something to yourself, you're able to kind of manage that a little bit better. And I don't like having to manage and work around guys. And when I'm smallmouth fishing, I like to be able to move and fish the way that I want to. I don't want to just like lock down in a place and here's my cast. Like those fish like to move, and I want to be able to move with them. And it just makes it more difficult when you're fishing around other guys.
Brandon, I admire you at the St. Lawrence River because not only you're successful there, but it seems like you do it in a different region. Like Kyle was somewhat mentioning, being in the river sometimes, going a long run in 2013, being by yourself there. Yet you might check those areas in the next years, and oh, I was here that year, here the next year, I'm checking those places, but you don't just like die in those areas. And I think it's interesting, like the Johnstons always do. If it's a 4-pounder on average that's going to get you in the top 15, they somehow are on schools of 4 1/4. And it drives me nuts on like how you find that little difference to be able to separate yourself. They always have like a 1.5 to 2.5 pound lead after 2 or 3 days of competition. I'm like, how in the world do they always find that next school? But for you, the one year that you didn't do as hot, a 19th place finish, was the year that they were like betting the most. It was the shallowest we've ever seen the St. Lawrence event get played. I think it was the June event. We saw the day one leader do it sight fishing, and then it was eventually won that way. Has that ever factored for you? Because I feel like July is that time period where Kyle and I mentioned a conversation the other day. 1 week up north in July is like 3 weeks down south, where like if they're doing something here for 1 week, they're going to do it down south for the next 3 weeks, whatever their stage in. They're not going to really change for almost a month down south, but they're changing each week up here. We always kind of see a little bit of lingering spawn and immediate post spawn, and you don't want the fish leaving you. But have you ever had to rely on sight fishing smallmouth? Because I never see you do it on camera, but that could always be a day 1, day 2 thing when we might not see you.
Yeah, I've definitely done it. And the thing is up here is that I would say when there's not ice on the water, there are smallmouth that you can sight fish here, whether they're on beds or not. And that year that I did struggle, that was just missed opportunities. That's kind of the stuff that, people don't see the full story of it. But I had probably 25 pounds the first day, and I fished a different part of the system that I normally do. I had found fish that I felt like were potential to win, and I just missed all those opportunities. And I finally just bailed on it, and had to kind of work my way back up. I think I was way down in the standings day 1, and then came back day 2 and day 3 to work my way back up. It is just, that one has always haunted me, even though it wasn't a bad finish. Like 19th here to me just seems like a gut punch. And now I've made top 10 every other time other than that, but I've never been able to pull off another win. And so you have to be able to mix things up here. Sometimes you have to mix in some shallow and some deep stuff. And really, honestly, targeting shallow smallmouth is one of the most fun ways you can catch a bass ever. Just because they're so aggressive. And I mean, it's several of the top 10s have came with shallow smallmouth in my bags for sure.
I feel like other than your 19th, your worst day of fishing on the St. Lawrence was your 3rd place year. And that was the same thing. You did the same thing those 2 years. You literally were like so far down the standings and made an adjustment, or you were like, screw this, I'm going to go sell out because like five anglers on the elites know how to swing for the fences actually. And I'm going to go do that. And you end up connecting. But I just wanted to mention that as well, is that we've seen you're not just launch at the St. Lawrence in top 10 from day 1 on. You've had to really make some big jumps late in those events. So what's the difference for you on a game plan on why you didn't do what you end up adjusting to? Like on day 1, you have a game plan and it doesn't necessarily work out. So then you don't even consider a thing and you go and do that the rest of the event, and you end up making so much ground.
I think I get sucked into what I like to call decoy bass sometimes. Where
#Turney T.
Yeah, where you get a little bit of a clue and you're like, okay, I'm gonna run with this. Like, and a lot of times with smallmouth, the biggest ones will be doing something different than the rest of the population. And I'll find something like that and think, man, I'm just gonna blow this out. Like, here's my chance at breaking the century belt with smallmouth. And then for whatever reason on day one, I lose them, or they're not there like they were. And several times I found myself way down. Actually, more often than not, I would say day one, I'm not in the top 10. If you went back and like really looked at, I know, see, what year was it? 2018, I believe we fished in August.
Yes.
And I
That was the end of the year. That was the last event of the season.
Yeah. And I had caught over 25 pounds every day of practice. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is my chance. And I caught like 20 and a half the first day, and I think I was in 40th. But then I went back day two and I caught almost 27 and then jumped up. But when the weights are really, really tight, like they are here, when you do catch those really big bags, you're able to make those big jumps. You just can't dig yourself too big of a hole. And that's where you can't, when the weights are really tight, you can't climb out of a great big giant hole without having like one of the biggest bags of the entire tournament. And hopefully we don't have to do that this year. It's way less stressful if you can just catch them day one, be inside the top 10, and then just keep catching them. But that's not always the way it works.
So Brandon, this is something I wanted to talk about a little bit, because I feel like people that you start to see it more often now. People make trips up north to go smallmouth fish, even if they're just fun fishing. And I think that most people, I think everybody really underestimates how big the big water is up there. So if you had tips for somebody that's really not experienced in maybe boating in that kind of water, because I think that, obviously can get so dangerous. What are some of, just the general tips you'd give somebody, before going up to fish, giant bodies of water like the Great Lakes?
Number one thing is just take your time. That's where most people screw up, is they get in a rush. And I'll be the first one to say that I will drive as fast as possible and still remain safe and in control. But when you get in that big water, you have to really understand what your boat can do, what your motor can do, what it's capable of, and how you need to maneuver. People ask me all the time, like, why do you run a 20-footer? Right. And I've always ran a 20-foot skeeter. Like my entire career on a 20-footer. And I've thought about running 21s, but I like that shorter boat when we get up north in really, really big water. Because to me, it's a little bit more maneuverable. So I may have to come up a wave and slide down the back side of it, not to dive into the next one. And you want to be able to respond, and that little bit shorter boat actually fits inside those waves sometimes. And so for me, it's just a little bit easier to maneuver and control. And you need to, like, when people come up here, just, you don't get in a hurry, but you need to go out there in it. You need to experience it so that you understand what you need to do if you are fishing a tournament up here. And practice time is the best time to go do that. Or, when you're not even practicing for a tournament, so that you're not feeling rushed. You can get out there, you can get comfortable. In worst case scenario, you just idle. You can idle through some really, really big stuff. And if they're super big, don't take them straight on. You got to take them at an angle. And that's not a big deal. And that what I like to try to tell people is, if you can run them at an angle, you can run a trough at 55, 60 miles an hour in 8-footers. Like you get in the trough, which people don't know, that's the low end of the wave. And you can run those troughs, if they're at the right angle, almost full speed, sliding in between them. And so sometimes you have to run those troughs
zigzag,
and then tack back over, so you come up over the wave, down the other side, and you may run the trough back the other way. And it's not a straight line, right? Like, it's not the quickest way to get there, but sometimes that's what you have to do.
Sure.
Brandon, there's a difference between the St. Lawrence River and Lake Ontario. We can group it together as one body of water in the Thousand Islands, but when you were having a game plan for the St. Lawrence River versus Lake Ontario, can you explain a couple differences and what it means for smallmouth? Because I think that Bass Lab does a good job of showing the differences at times, but people don't understand how much current is actually coming through some of those places till you see the neck down areas of the St. Lawrence, and how even bait selection for the same species of fish are going to be totally different in the same depth zone if you're just in the lake a little or just in the river a little. So because we've seen you do both very well, what's your mindset on that? When do you feel the lake is effective for you? And when do you feel like the river is, and why are they so different? Even though they're like literally next door to each other.
I think they're both effective at the same time. It just depends on what I end up finding that week. You know, sometimes I find them in the lake, sometimes I find them better in the river. And you don't know which one is going to be better. On average, the lake has more 5+ pounders. It always has. It's the reason I ran there in 2013 when we first came here, is because when you look at tournament stats, every single tournament that's close to the lake, on average, those weights are higher. And that's, so I always spend my time out there, but you don't always find them. And so then I may have to rely on the river to catch those fish. And people think that they have a lot of current in their river, but you don't understand it until you see the St. Lawrence River. I mean, literally think about, some people probably don't even know this, but the entire Great Lakes, like think about how much water that is. Like, just anyone that's watching, just grab your smartphone, look at Google Maps or whatever map device you have on there, and just zoom out and look at how big the Great Lakes are, right? Like, you'll see the Great Lakes and you won't be able to pick out any other lake on the entire country. All of those filter out through the St. Lawrence River. That is a massive, massive amount of water that flows through that river. And I have seen it where I am flowing at 9 miles an hour down the river, just 9 to 10 miles an hour, drifting down, right? The wind gets going with the current and it's just ripping. You can't hold with I don't care how big your Ultrex is, you just can't hold. It's just too much. You can barely even idle. Like, I've kicked my motor in gear and idled and sat still. You just don't move. And
that's why we see the drifting aspect. People aren't.
That's
just,
why you see guys doing that, exactly.
And it's not just
you
drift,
can't hold.
Yeah.
So you're holding your rod, but you can't hold your boat in place, and so you're drifting through areas. You're getting on your big motor. You run back up, and you guys are finding these drift lines and these current seams, and depending on how much flow there is each year or which wind direction you have, different things like that will change where those current seams are. And that's where those smallmouth are going to sit, right? The ones in the river, they can't roam around as much as the ones in the lake because that current has to push them and set them up, or else they're just going to burn all their energy. So they need to get behind something. They need to get in those current seams where they can actively feed, but not waste a bunch of energy, right? Like a basketball size boulder can hide several 4-pounders if they need to, because the way that the water pushes and flows over that, they can get behind it and be happy little campers. Whereas in the lake, those fish can roam a lot more, right? They're not as condensed or like straight jacketed by the current of the river. So there's pros and cons to that, right?
Yeah.
Definitely.
And you've got the control drift. It's not just like, oh, these guys have the electronics to show them where the fish are, and then all they got to do is float backwards and catch them. There's like a certain speed that you can see. You can see a guy beside you on the same stretch floating at 5 miles an hour backwards, where you're at 3.7, and you're slowly tapping your trolling motor and keeping it the right speed. And that's a trial and error thing each year, depending on that, or each spot. Ogdensburg is going to be different than Waddington. Waddington's going to be different than Cape Vincent. Sorry, Kyle, I'm doing this. I'm just infatuated with the fact of the electronics improvements haven't changed the top winning weights for events. It's made the check line get harder to get. You got to get more weight to get the check line. But we see the St. Lawrence River. It's weird to think you've got this many top 10s and you've never broke 90 pounds. Yet we think about the St. Lawrence breaking 100 every time because you had 88 and change when you won there, and then 80 something and change will get you a top 10 almost every time, unless it's that down year. For you, when you found those fish in 2013, I mean, your graphs weren't black and white, but that's about as archaic as it gets, is thinking about 2013 electronics compared to now. So utilizing just down imaging, or you probably might have graphed them with side imaging and then finding them on 2D. How crazy is it that you're catching the same quality of fish at times with live sonar, 360, the DI and sonar is even better than it was, side imaging, you have all that, yet the same quality of fish. You're really dependent on that body of water. And that's why places like the St. Lawrence always show out. It's never like we just unlocked a way to catch 150 pounds. It's we just unlocked a way to catch one more pound to maybe win this event,
Yeah, they're really, I mean, the fishery is only capable of so much. That's really all you can do, right? I mean, it is 100% capable of catching 25 pounds a day. No doubt. I've seen it. I've caught way too many 25 plus pound bags here to think otherwise. The tricky part is that having the amount of time to do it. Now, when we launch out of Clayton, it's much more likely to happen. And I think if we came here late August, early September, the weights would be even higher, right? We come very oftentimes when these fish are transitioning and they're spread out, right? You saw last year, the Johnson brothers were still doing a lot of sight fishing. Guys are catching them out in 40, 45 foot of water. So when they're spread out, they're not fully fed up off after the spawn yet, your weights aren't as high. They're really high in June, like when they're first spawning, and then later in the year when those fish get really grouped up and fed up. And the big thing is that you have to have the amount of time to be able to weed through those, right? There's a big difference between a 4-pound smallmouth and a 5-pound smallmouth, and being able to catch 25-pound smallmouth in 4 days is not easy to do.
Yeah, I think it almost took 80 pounds for that September event, Kyle. You were at for the Open when we had it, obviously the fall feed up. Yeah, for 3 days.
That was insane. That was wild. We were just talking about that.
And those are the same fish, right? You're talking about the same fish, but they're just bulked up that much more, being able to feed a month longer than what they have now. And that makes a big difference. And I think when I won in 2013, that was probably my best opportunity I've had at being able to break 100 pounds, even though I didn't get very close. But I only fished 10 hours out of a possible 32 hours. So, if I would have been able to fish, say 20 hours, I might have been able to break 100 pounds. Just, I haven't seen it, I won't say easy, but I haven't seen it that good since then again, where they were just that bunched up, and half the fish I caught bit it before it even hit the bottom. And then it hasn't
so much so that you had 6 in the live well one time.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I literally just thought about
so
this.
I could have had 90.
You would have broke 90. You would have had 90 pounds, 12 ounces.
I would have. Yeah.
Kyle, go ahead before I get in trouble. You step in before I get in trouble.
No, I kind of just want to let this one breathe for a second. It got a little testy there.
It's hot in here.
So let's circle back. This is kind of my final question. It might be really easy to name your top 3 smallmouth baits, but if you had to say like your top 3 smallmouth baits for fishing up north, and then your top 3 largemouth baits for fishing down south in July, let's hear them.
I would say the first 2 would probably be the X Zone Hot Shot minnow, the Finesse Slammer from X Zone, and then I'd probably say like the Rapala Shadow Rat Deep. Caught a lot lot of big ones on that.
I think the
especially
only
Champlain and stuff.
I think the only time I saw Brandon Palaniuk close to the shore, other than for takeoff and check-in, was he caught one on a jerkbait one year on Bass Live on the way back in, like right on the bank.
Yeah, that, I mean, for northern smallmouth, like it just crushes them. And then for down south, I would say probably Rapala DT16 is going to be always tied on. A big flutter spoon is going to be a ticket, and then probably the X Zone Mega Swammer on either a Tokyo rig or on a jig head, depending on
peanut, whatever
what you have. No peanuts.
Explain the hot shot minnow. Is that a drop shot or Ned rig? And the slammer is obviously a drop shot based lure, probably.
Yeah, both the finesse slammer and the hot shot minnow, I mostly throw on a drop shot. Both can be thrown on a Ned rig. Most oftentimes, if I'm throwing a Ned rig, I throw their Ned zone. But you can throw it on that. I mean, hot shot minnow makes a phenomenal Demiki rig bait. It has a super unique little tail and action to it that not a lot of minnow style baits out there have. So I'm looking for the first northern swing that I get to put it to work. So I'm really looking forward to it. We launched it this year at the Classic, and I have several of them tied up in my boat right now. I can promise you that.
I literally had to write a product spotlight over that exact minnow, and right when I saw it, I thought to myself, I wonder what Brandon Palaniuk's going to do with that come July.
Gosh,
yeah,
I can't wait.
They get to talk about it on social two days before the St. Lawrence, so no one else at the event can order them in time or can't get their hands on them. So I like that. He's like, hey, can you hold that release until 1 week later when we go to ICAST so that nobody gets them. But Brandon, something different. We've been to the St. Lawrence 2013, 15, 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21. You weren't here for the 19 event, but other than 2013, we've never had this situation where we have New York and Canada in play in the river, and we have New York and Canada in play in the lake. Other than 2013, we had the lake off limits until 2020. And then obviously we had Canada not in play the last 2 years. We finally opened it up for the open last fall. So what do you expect when we have the lake with both countries in play and the river, both countries in play? Or is this going to fish a little bigger? Are we going to see some areas we've never seen before? Also with Clayton being right there, are we going to see a lot more anglers in the lake this year and maybe even going farther in the lake than just those close bays in vicinity? Are you, I'm not saying for you to give the game plan, but are there places much farther out there in Ontario that people can explore that might be worth making the run depending on weather?
No, Ontario's so big. There's stuff out there, places smallmouth live that
no one's
guys have never even driven over. I mean, that's the reality of it. It's like there's smallmouth bass out there that will live and die and never see a lure. And if it's just whether or not you can exploit that, because Mother Nature comes into play, and sometimes you just can't get to places. So if you start looking out there and you start getting out there 20, 30, 40, 50 miles, like that's not the same as 20, 30, 40, 50 miles in the river. You start talking 20 miles in the lake, that's about the equivalent of 50 miles in the river, because it could take you forever. And the predominant wind is blowing all the way across that lake. So it can get really big. I'm excited to have Canada in play. I've got some really good stuff over there that I've caught really big ones on that I haven't fished since 2018, I think. And so I'm excited to be able to get back over there and then see if things are still looking the same as they were. It just, for me, it opens up your possibilities that much more, right? And even though I've been coming here since 2013, there is still so much that I have not looked at. And so every time we come back, I always, put a check mark on, like, go look at new stuff. Like, go, either find new stuff or write stuff off. But I'm always looking at my Lake Master charts and Google Earth and doing all this, map study to try to find these new areas and find that place where you can break that 100-pound mark.
Do you think that's possible even in the immediate post spawn in July? with Canada in play.
Yeah.
We had 90. You think 100 can happen in July, or would we need to do August or September?
I mean, there's no doubt it's possible. It's possible any week of the year here. It's more likely the later we get, but it's definitely possible.
So you're telling me if there's ice on the lake, we could still reach 100 pounds.
Drop it to
I
the
promise
right
you
holes.
they still live there, whether or not you can find them, you can get them to bite. But I promise you there is a school with 100 pounds of bass in it somewhere under the ice. It's just whether or not you can get there and catch it.
I agree.
Do you have, I'm assuming you do you have the target lock on your boat?
I do have target lock on my boat.
How will that help those guys in the current? Like we talk about the river, and you're kind of the mega lives limited when you're having to control your drift with your trolling motor. You're kind of pinned into where you have to point. That's why 360 has also often been at times better, because it shows you the structure without, no matter where you're facing.
Yeah.
But now you'll be able to hold and see for some of those guys.
Well, and I think in the river aspect of it, one of the coolest features of that is the actual target lock feature. So if I see, we'll just use a boulder as an example. If I see a boulder either on my Mega Live or on my Mega 360, on my Solix unit, I can just press on the screen, hold, it's going to cycle around, little menu's going to pop up, and I hit target lock, and then the target lock in my Mega Live transducer is going to separate from the Ultrex, right? It's going to go off of Minn Kota steer. It's going to go and it's going to lock on that target. And so if you're in the current and your drift changes, right? Say like this is my boat and this is my target lock. If my boat moves, that target lock is going to always stay on that boulder. And so as that current pushes you around, or you try to slide up, or as you slide back, it's always going to be on your screen. And we've never had that ability, right? So now I can keep that on my screen, and I can position my boat. I can slow my boat up or speed it, or slow it down or speed it up if I need to, without having to constantly like scan back over and see if it's there and then reposition my boat, scan back over and see. And that's going to be a big key, especially in the river, just being able to do that. Or if the wind gets blowing, which it will blow at some point, it's going to blow this week. And just being able to have that will be a huge advantage, instead of just drifting over it and looking at your 2D and then trying to figure out like, okay, is it 30 yards up there now since I just saw it and have to pitch up? Now you know exactly where it needs to be.
Brandon, last thing before we let you go, for Bassmaster fantasy fishing players, should they pick you this week? Because Bucket A has Chris Johnston, Corey Johnston, Brandon Palaniuk, Chris Zaldane, Brandon Lester, John Cox. I mean, everybody in the top.
To me.
I mean, should they? Yeah. Hey, you got to give your BP guarantee of the week.
They got to do their homework. Do your homework. Play your odds. I mean, pretty much all those names you listed in there, you can't go wrong with. So,
someone's going to go wrong with them. I promise. They're probably.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have to play. You got to play the game though, right? You got to play the percentages. You got to play the odds of a guy making a top 10. Has he made a lot here in the past? Does he have a lot of percentage? Maybe you need to go with someone that you think might make a top 10, but doesn't hold as much of a percentage, so you can gain some of those extra points versus everyone else. I mean, that you got to play the game. And so don't ever think that just looking at the statistics that anything is guaranteed, because nothing in bass fishing is guaranteed. And you have to earn it every single day. So we will see.
Kyle, I lied. I'm going to say one more thing. So, Brandon, you were in our seat and you had to pick a fantasy fishing team. And I'm just going to be completely honest. It wasn't the best picks. I know obviously we put you in Florida and asked you to pick them. So that's not necessarily your strong suit, even though you've done well there at times. It's kind of a Achilles heel. How did you feel under the pressure of having to pick a team, knowing people were going to go and pull the receipts on how that team did?
Man, I mean, it's a lot of pressure. You just can't be afraid to fail.
Not everybody can be the king.
You just got to sometimes go with your gut instinct. I mean, someone will dethrone Ronnie. I mean, he can't be that lucky for
Tommy Sanders. Yeah, Tommy Sanders.
Tommy's just legendary.
Tommy won Santee Cooper, by the way. Like, for fantasy fishing, his 5-man team was #1. Kyle had to freaking interview him for a story, and he couldn't even win any prizes. What the heck?
And he fishes the least amount at anyone in the office, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
No question.
Well, Brandon, we
and that's just
appreciate you for joining us for the pattern of the month for July. If you've listened this whole time and you're trying to remember what we covered, he basically said you got to find a big piece of structure or a good piece of cover if you're fishing shallow. Otherwise, fishing deep down south, they're going to look for that cooler water or the schools of fish, the current, different things will factor there. And for smallmouth, July for him is transition month. Those fish, we're going to see some fish on bed at the St. Lawrence River on Bassmaster Live. We'll also see some guys fishing way offshore. So in July, up north, keep your options open. So Brandon, appreciate you joining us for the Pattern of the Month episode for July. For Kyle and myself, we will see you guys in the next episode, and we'll probably see Brandon Palaniuk, because he is our Angler of the Year leader, day one of Bassmaster Live at the St. Lawrence. You will not want to miss that.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to it.